Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Appalachian Hills. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1862. The nation was torn apart by the bloodiest conflict in American history. But in a remote valley of McDowell County, West Virginia, nestled between the jagged ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, a different kind of darkness was unfolding, a darkness that would remain hidden for nearly a century. The Reed family homestead stood isolated on the eastern slope of Beartown Mountain, a two-story timber structure weathered by decades of harsh mountain winters. According to county land records dated 1831, the property was originally purchased by Thomas Reed, a former school teacher from Richmond who sought isolation after the death of his wife during childbirth. The parcel encompassed approximately 120 acres of mixed woodland and small cleared fields, bordered on the north by Dry Fork River and on the east by what locals called Preacher's Path, a narrow trail that wound through the mountains toward the settlement of Welch. The original deed, preserved in county archives until its mysterious disappearance in 1968, described the property as containing one modest dwelling house of timber construction, one barn in poor repair, and various outbuildings of indeterminate use, formerly the seasonal residence of fur trappers. The document was signed by Thomas Reed and countersigned by Judge William Harkins, whose personal journal, discovered during a library renovation in 1951, contained this curious notation: finalized sale of Beartown property to Reed today. An unusual man of intense intellectual bearing, expressed peculiar interest in the property's isolation and the old Indian burial ground nearby, paid full price in gold coin without haggling, which is uncommon enough to note. Thomas Reed raised his two daughters, Margaret and Eleanor, in near-complete isolation. School attendance records from the county's lone schoolhouse show that the girls attended sporadically for only 3 years, between 1835 and 1838, before their father withdrew them permanently, citing his intention to provide superior education at home. The school teacher's annual report to the county education board noted that both Reed girls display uncommon intellectual capacity and scientific curiosity, particularly regarding anatomy and chemical processes, though they relate poorly to other children and have been observed collecting and dissecting small animals during recess periods. Church records indicate the family appeared for Easter and Christmas services at the Methodist Chapel in Welch, though they rarely socialized with other congregants. Reverend Josiah Miller's personal correspondence, discovered in a collection donated to the West Virginia Historical Society in 1940, described Thomas Reed as a man of formidable education but concerning temperament, who speaks at length about his scientific investigations, but falls silent when questioned about their nature. His daughters mirror his reserve and watch other parishioners with an unsettling intensity, as if studying specimens rather than fellow Christians. Thomas Reed maintained sporadic correspondence with several medical institutions and natural philosophers throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Letters preserved in the archives of the Philadelphia Academy of Medicine, accessed by researchers in 1962, reveal Reed's continuing interest in what he termed nutritive transference, the theory that consuming specific animal organs could transfer their properties to the consumer. In one letter to Dr. Harold Whitcomb, dated 1847, Reed wrote, "My experiments with concentrated liver extract have yielded promising results in treating anemic conditions. I have begun preliminary work with neural tissue from various species and observed marked effects on mental acuity when prepared according to my developing methodology." Dr. Whitcomb's response, dated 3 months later, expressed scientific skepticism but personal curiosity. While modern medicine has largely abandoned such Paracelsian concepts of sympathetic consumption, your detailed observations suggest empirical benefits worthy of continued investigation. I would caution, however, against extending these experiments beyond acceptable boundaries of natural philosophy. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten. Local records indicate that Sisters Margaret and Eleanor Reed, unmarried women in their 40s, had lived alone at the homestead since their parents' passing in 1857. Thomas Reed died of pneumonia that January, followed 3 months later by his wife, Sarah, whose cause of death was listed simply as decline in the county death register. The sisters inherited the property and continued their isolated existence. The county physician who attended Thomas Reed in his final days, Dr. James Blackwood, wrote in his medical journal, "Reed, even on his deathbed, spoke with remarkable animation about his life's research. He insisted I accept a leather-bound volume of his notes as payment for my services, extracting my promise to deliver it to his daughters upon his passing. The pages I glimpsed contained disturbing anatomical drawings and formulae for preparations unlike any medical text I have encountered. I am unsure whether the man was a misunderstood genius or suffered from scientific delusions. They were known in the nearby settlement of Welch as reclusive but respectable spinsters who sold herbal remedies and occasionally attended church services at the Methodist chapel. According to accounts collected by the McDowell County Historical Society in 1938, Margaret was the taller of the two, with a severe countenance and precise manner of speaking that intimidated many locals. Eleanor was described as more pleasant in appearance, but oddly silent, often staring intently at whoever was speaking as if memorizing their features. Ida Jenkins, interviewed at age 93 for the Historical Society's Oral History Project, recalled, "My mother would send me to the Reed place for Miss Margaret's headache powder, which worked better than anything the town doctor prescribed. But she always warned me never to eat or drink anything the sisters offered, and never to go there after sunset." The sisters kept their house immaculate, which folks found strange for such an isolated place. Miss Eleanor would follow me with her eyes while Miss Margaret measured out the powders, and sometimes I'd catch them exchanging glances like they were having a conversation without words. They always asked about who was traveling through the area, especially men on their own. Tax assessor notes from 1859 described the Reed property as well-maintained despite its remote situation, with a productive garden, small orchard of apple and pear trees, and modest livestock, including 6 chickens, 2 goats, and 1 mule. The assessor noted the interior of the home contained an unusual quantity of books for a mountain dwelling, and that the sisters seemed educated beyond what one expects in these parts. A supplement to the tax record, discovered in 1955 but subsequently lost, reportedly contained additional observations. The cellar door was secured with an unusual locking mechanism of apparent foreign manufacture. When questioned about it, Miss Margaret explained it protected their father's scientific equipment from potential theft. The sisters maintain a small laboratory continuing their father's research into medicinal preparations, which may explain the unfamiliar odors and sounds emanating from the lower level of the house. They refused my request to examine this area, citing concerns about contamination of sensitive experiments. What made their case remarkable wasn't just their eventual disappearance, but what was discovered afterward. County records from October 1862 note that when neighbors hadn't seen the sisters for nearly 3 weeks, local constable James Whitaker rode out to investigate. According to his sworn statement, preserved in county archives until 1968, the journey took nearly 4 hours on horseback due to recent rains that had turned the mountain paths to mud. Whitaker arrived at the Reed homestead in late afternoon as shadows lengthened across the valley. The house stood silent, smoke-free chimney suggesting no one had been there for some time. The constable's report, filed on October 28, 1862, describes finding the house in perfect order, as if prepared for guests. The oak dining table was set with the family's finest china, silver candlesticks containing candles burned down to stubs, and 2 empty chairs pulled out. In the kitchen, Whitaker noted finding sufficient provisions to last through winter, including preserved meats and canned vegetables from their garden. Most unsettling, according to Whitaker's report, was a third-place setting at the table that appeared to have been used. A plate contained remnants of what appeared to be meat and gravy, he wrote, with a napkin bearing a rust-colored stain beside it. The constable also noted finding a leather-bound book open on a side table, though he admitted to being insufficient in my letters to comprehend its contents. A supplement to Whitaker's official report, discovered in his personal papers after his death in 1879, and preserved by his grandson until donating them to the County Historical Society in 1935, contained observations omitted from the official record. The meat upon the plate bore no resemblance to any game or livestock I have encountered in 40 years of hunting these mountains. The texture and color suggested something unwholesome. More disturbing still was the cellar door, which stood ajar despite an elaborate lock that appeared to have been forced open from within. I descended the stairs but found only darkness and an odor so foul it prevented further investigation without proper lighting. Something had been dragged across the packed earth floor toward a tunnel-like aperture in the far wall. I confess I lacked courage to follow this passage alone and in darkness. Nothing appeared disturbed or stolen. The sisters' few valuable possessions remained in their proper places. Their heavy winter coats still hung by the door, and a small lockbox containing $27 in mixed currency and several gold coins was found untouched beneath a floorboard. In the main bedroom, its location apparently known to Whitaker from previous official visits. But the Reed sisters were nowhere to be found. The initial investigation yielded little. With the Civil War raging, resources were scarce, and 2 missing spinsters weren't a priority. Whitaker's report indicates he searched the immediate grounds and outbuildings, finding nothing amiss except for unusual drag marks leading from the rear of the house toward the densely wooded eastern property line. He followed these marks approximately 50 yards before losing the trail in the rocky terrain. A cursory search party was organized 2 days later, consisting of Whitaker and 4 local men. They searched for approximately 6 hours, concentrating on the area east of the house where the drag marks had been observed. According to the constable's supplementary report, dated November 2, 1862, they found nothing except a woman's hair comb near the edge of a steep ravine, which one of the search party members identified as similar to those worn by the elder Reed sister. With no further evidence and increasing demands on manpower due to the war, the search was abandoned. One member of the search party, Ezekiel Tanner, later told his son a story that became family lore, recorded in 1947 by folklore collector Sarah Hawkins. According to Tanner's account, the search party also found a trail of unusual footprints leading away from the house, as if made by someone with an irregular gait or dragging one leg. The prints were deep, suggesting someone of substantial weight, yet narrower than would be expected, almost like a woman wearing a man's boots. Constable Whitaker reportedly ordered the men not to include this detail in their official statements, saying, "Some things are better left unreported when there's no good explanation." The prevailing theory, as noted in Whitaker's final report on the matter, was that the women had either fled the increasing violence in the region or perhaps joined relatives further north. A notation in the margin, apparently added later in a different hand, suggests possible that Reed women left with Union sympathizers, as elder sister once expressed Northern sentiments at church gathering. The case was effectively closed by November 1862, the homestead eventually claimed by the county for unpaid taxes, and the story might have ended there. But in 1927, 65 years later, the case would resurface in a most unexpected way. As recorded in the Welch Daily News archives of April 17, 1927, a timber survey crew working for the newly formed Allegheny Lumber Company was marking trees near the old Reed property when foreman William Tanner noticed an unusual depression in the ground approximately 400 yards behind where the Reed house once stood. The depression had been partially exposed by recent heavy rains that had washed away years of accumulated forest debris. Tanner, a native of the region and coincidentally the grandson of Ezekiel Tanner, who had participated in the original search for the Reed sisters, recognized the sunken area as potentially indicating a collapsed underground structure. After clearing away surface vegetation, the crew discovered a deteriorated wooden hatch nearly hidden by a thicket of rhododendron. The underground chamber wasn't on any existing property maps and appeared to have been deliberately concealed. According to the foreman's statement to the Welch Daily News, what they found inside was a room unlike any root cellar I've ever seen, approximately 12 feet square and 7 feet high. The underground chamber had been professionally constructed with stone walls and a timber ceiling that had partially collapsed over the decades. The walls were lined with wooden shelves containing dozens of glass jars of varying sizes. Most had shattered over the years, but several remained intact, containing what appeared to be preserved meats and unknown organic material suspended in cloudy liquid. Tanner's account, corroborated by 3 other crew members in signed statements to the county sheriff, described finding a heavy wooden table in the center of the chamber. The table's surface was stained dark brown and black, with deep grooves running to its edges. Along one wall stood a smaller table, bearing what appeared to be medical implements. Several rusted metal instruments, including knives, saws, and clamps of unusual design. One crew member, Joseph Hatfield, provided additional details in a personal letter to his brother, discovered among family papers in 1971. The instruments we found weren't like regular butchering tools. They were finer, more precise, with ivory handles and markings in what looked like Latin. There was a book of drawings showing human anatomy with specific parts highlighted and numbered, corresponding to the labels on some of the remaining jars. Will wouldn't let us talk about the worst of what we saw, said it would cause a panic and get the company in trouble with the law. But I'll tell you this much. What those women were preserving wasn't deer meat or bear, unless deer and bear have hands and faces. Perhaps most disturbing was a leather-bound ledger found in a metal box partially protected from the elements. Water damage had rendered much of it illegible, but entries dating from 1859 through 1862 remained somewhat readable. The McDowell County Historical Society, which briefly held the ledger before its disappearance in 1968, described it as containing recipes of an unusual nature, along with detailed observations that suggested scientific experimentation rather than domestic cookery. Dr. Elias Thornton, a historian of Appalachian folk medicine who examined the ledger in 1965, wrote in his personal journal, "The Reed documents represent something far beyond traditional mountain remedies or even the questionable medical practices of the era. Their recipes detail systematic processing of human tissue for consumption, with specific preparation methods depending on the desired transfer of qualities. Most disturbing is their apparent scientific approach. They recorded detailed observations of effects, modified their techniques based on results, and maintained a consistent theoretical framework derived from their father's earlier research." One legible entry, dated August 17, 1861, was transcribed as follows. "E believes we have perfected the preparation. The specimen from Morgan Creek required prolonged soaking in the saltpeter solution, followed by 12 hours in the herbal tincture as father described in his notes. The flesh remained firm, and the taste was much improved from previous attempts. The sensation of vitality lasted until dawn, though E experienced the trembling in her hands again afterward. We must adjust the mercury proportion in the preservation fluid, as the metallic aftertaste remains problematic. The brain tissue yielded the most pronounced effects, confirming father's hypothesis regarding the concentration of vital essence in the neural matter." Another entry from February 1862 mentioned, "Our guests continue to arrive, though we must be more selective. Some understand our work better than others. Mr. Holloway from Cumberland spoke too freely in town about our suppers and the unique sensations they produced. E insists we must be more cautious. Father's work is too important to risk exposure by loose tongues." The next visitor claims to be a cattle buyer from Pennsylvania, but his hands suggest a man unaccustomed to livestock. We shall see what knowledge he brings to the table. His physical condition appears excellent, suggesting superior quality if careful preparation is observed. A third entry, dated June 1862, read, "The war brings both opportunity and risk. Deserters from both armies occasionally find their way to our door seeking shelter. These men, already separated from their units and expected to be missing, provide ideal specimens without raising immediate alarm. However, they also bring news of increasing lawlessness in the region, which may eventually direct unwanted attention to our remote location. We have begun preparations for relocation, if necessary, though abandoning Father's laboratory would severely impede our progress. E has identified a suitable property near Staunton where our work might continue under the guise of a private sanitarium, should circumstances force our departure. A final partial entry, dated October 1862, shortly before the sisters' disappearance, read, "Unexpected arrival today. Claims to be searching for his brother, the cattle buyer who visited last month. Showed remarkable interest in our preparation methods. E thinks he suspects, but I disagree. Have invited him to supper tomorrow. Will use the special china and the blue candles. If he is amenable to our work, he may prove a valuable ally. If not, the remainder of this entry was illegible due to water damage, according to the Historical Society's notes. The discovery prompted a brief investigation by local authorities, but with no bodies found and the case so old, it was once again closed after just 2 weeks." Sheriff Walter Dougherty's report, dated May 3, 1927, concluded, "While unusual, the underground chamber appears to have been used for storage of home preserves and medicinal preparations, in keeping with the Reed sisters' known activities as herbalists. No evidence of criminal activity can be determined after such passage of time." This official dismissal contradicted the sheriff's private correspondence with state authorities, discovered in 1961 during research for a history of law enforcement in West Virginia. In a letter to the state attorney general dated April 30, 1927, Dougherty wrote, "The situation at the old Reed property presents a troubling case. Evidence suggests activities of the most unwholesome nature, potentially including multiple homicides. However, given the age of the case, the prominent local families potentially connected to the sisters through business or social dealings, and the absence of identifiable victims, I recommend allowing this matter to rest. Reopening such an old case would bring unwelcome attention to our county without possibility of resolution. The remains of the underground chamber were filled in during road expansion work in 1929, and physical evidence was lost. The ledger was transferred to the County Historical Society, where it remained until it vanished during an office relocation in 1968. What happened to the Reed sisters? What were these mysterious suppers referenced in their writings? The answers would begin to emerge through fragments of information pieced together over decades by various researchers and historians. Tax records from 1855 through 1861 show that despite their seemingly modest means, the Reed sisters paid their obligations promptly, sometimes with gold coin rather than scrip or barter, unusual for the remote area and time period. A notation in the 1861 tax register indicates the assessor's surprise at receiving 5 gold eagles in payment when most can barely scrape together continental currency in these troubled times. The source of this unexpected wealth remained unexplained in official records, though church attendance logs provide a possible clue. Records from the Welch Methodist congregation note that the sisters stopped attending regular services in late 1860, with the pastor's notations indicating they had taken to peculiar ideas not in keeping with Scripture. A further entry from Easter Sunday 1861 records that Miss Margaret Reed spoke at length after service about her father's research into prolonging human vitality through unusual dietary practices, causing considerable discomfort among the congregation. They shall not be welcomed until such unseemly topics are abandoned. The church records also note that despite their absence from services, the Reed sisters made a substantial donation to the church building fund in June 1861, delivered by Eleanor Reed, who, according to the pastor's notation, appeared in excellent health and spirits, with a vibrancy most unusual for a woman of her years. especially one who has lived so long unmarried and in such isolation. William Carson, who served as church treasurer during this period, later told his daughter that the donation had consisted of a leather pouch containing gold teeth and several wedding bands, which the sisters claimed were family heirlooms they wished to contribute to the Lord's work. Carson reportedly melted down these items rather than selling them intact, an unusual decision he never explained. His daughter's account, recorded by the Historical Society in 1942, included her father's disturbing observation that one of the rings still bore traces of flesh when Miss Eleanor handed it to me, as if recently removed from its owner's hand. Perhaps most revealing was a letter discovered in 1964 among the personal effects of Dr. Samuel Blackwood, a physician who practiced in McDowell County during the Civil War. The letter, dated March 1862 and written by a colleague in Richmond, referenced those peculiar women in the mountains and warned Blackwood to exercise caution in your dealings with the Reed sisters, as their interests in anatomical specimens exceeds medical propriety. Their father's research was discontinued at the medical college for good reason, and I advise you to distance yourself from any continuation of his work. Reports have reached me of travelers entering that region who failed to arrive at their intended destinations. While the war provides ample explanation for missing persons, I cannot help but recall Thomas Reed's unorthodox theories regarding consumption of human tissue and its purported benefits. According to Dr. Blackwood's medical journal, also preserved in the Virginia Medical Historical Society archives until 1969, he had sold the sisters various chemicals and preservatives over a period of 2 years, believing they were for preparing herbal remedies. Entries dated between January 1860 and September 1862 record the sale of substances including alcohol, formaldehyde, saltpeter, and various acids, along with specialized glass containers. He noted becoming suspicious after Eleanor Reed requested quantities of preservation fluid sufficient for specimens much larger than botanical samples. A journal entry from July 1862 reads, Miss Reed today inquired about methods for preserving larger tissue samples without discoloration or deterioration of texture. When pressed on the nature of her work, she spoke vaguely of her father's unfinished research into nutritive properties of specially prepared organic matter and its effects on human vitality. I provided basic information, but must consider whether to continue supplying their unusual requirements. A subsequent entry, dated August 1862, records, Miss Margaret visited today requesting unusual quantities of chloroform and surgical instruments of precise specification. When I expressed concern about providing such items without medical purpose, she offered payment well above normal rates and suggested that my professional curiosity might be rewarded by accepting an invitation to dine with them and discuss their father's research. Something in her manner caused me to decline, though I did provide the requested supplies. I find myself increasingly disturbed by my association with the Reed sisters, yet unable to articulate specific concerns to authorities. A final entry regarding the Reed sisters appears in Dr. Blackwood's journal in early October 1862, just weeks before their disappearance. Visited Reed homestead today at Margaret's request to treat Eleanor for tremors and periodic confusion. Found elder sister in good health, but younger, displaying symptoms similar to those I observed in quicksilver poisoning at the Richmond Hospital. Recommended cessation of their experimental dietary regimen, which advice was poorly received. Margaret insisted their work was showing remarkable results and spoke of a breakthrough recently achieved. Observed unusual odor in kitchen area and sounds from what seemed to be a cellar or below-ground room. Left with distinct unease about their activities, Blackwood added a final note, underlined for emphasis, while at the Reed home, observed what appeared to be a human finger preserved in a specimen jar, labeled with a date and name. When I inquired about it, Margaret quickly removed it from view, claiming it was an anatomical teaching model inherited from their father. I am now convinced their activities extend beyond acceptable scientific inquiry into something sinister. The historical record grows murky here, but newspaper accounts from the Welsh Sentinel in early 1862 make oblique references to travelers who had gone missing in the region. Given the chaos of the Civil War, such disappearances weren't thoroughly investigated. One article from April 1862 mentions concerns raised about wayfarers who venture into the higher valleys, particularly near Beartown Mountain, never to return to expected destinations. Another piece from August 1862 reports that Mr. James Holloway, a merchant from Cumberland who traveled through our county in February last, has been reported missing by his business associates. Any information regarding his movements after departing Welch should be communicated to the sheriff's office. This, Holloway appears to be the same individual mentioned in the Reed sisters' ledger as having spoken too freely in town about our suppers. The Sentinel's editor, Abram Winters, published an unusual editorial in September 1862 titled The Duties of Rural Hospitality, which some historians believe contained veiled references to the Reed sisters. While Christian charity demands we offer shelter to travelers, recent events suggest caution regarding isolated homesteads where visitors are welcomed, but from which they may not depart. In these troubled times, when men go missing due to war's chaos, other predatory forces may take advantage to satisfy unwholesome appetites of various descriptions. Those who travel our mountain roads would be wise to inform companions of their intended route and expected arrival, and to decline invitations to dine where reputation is unknown. Local oral histories, collected by folklorist Martin Cosgrove in 1952 for his unpublished dissertation on Appalachian wartime narratives, include accounts from elderly residents who recalled rumors about the Reed sisters. One informant, Ida Mae Carpenter, then in her 90s, remembered her father speaking of those women who invited strangers to dine. Though it was the strangers who provided the main course, in a manner of speaking, Carpenter elaborated, "Pa wouldn't ever say it plain, not even years later when I was grown, but the way folks talked. Those Reed women were eating more than just pork and chicken up there. They'd invite a lone traveler to stay the night, fix him a fine supper with their best china. Then he'd become their next supper, if you take my meaning." Pa said they had strange ideas about getting stronger or living longer by eating certain parts of a person. Said their daddy had taught them these notions from old books he brought from Europe. Most folks thought it was just mountain talk, scary stories to keep children from wandering too far. But when those women disappeared and nobody ever found them, it made people wonder if there wasn't some truth to the tales. Another of Cosgrove's informants, William Hatfield, whose grandfather had been part of Constable Whitaker's search party in 1862, recalled family stories about the Reed homestead. Granddad wouldn't speak much about what they found there, but he never ate meat stew again after that day. Said he'd seen something in that house that turned his stomach forever on such dishes. He'd get angry if anyone pressed him for details. Just say that some women weren't as Christian as they appeared in church. Hatfield continued, "One night when Granddad was very old and sick with the fever that eventually took him, he told me what really bothered him about that place. Said they found jars in the cellar with human ears and fingers floating in them, each one labeled with a name and date. Said the constable made them all swear never to speak of it, since there was nothing to be done for the dead, and revealing such horrors would only cause panic. He believed those women had been killing and eating folks for years, believing it gave them special powers or longer life. Before he died, Granddad made me promise never to eat at a stranger's table without knowing what was being served." Cosgrove's note suggests that local superstition held that the Reed sisters had been practicing a form of ritualistic cannibalism, though he dismisses such claims as typical mountain folklore that transformed eccentric behavior into something more sinister over generations of retelling. His academic skepticism, however, failed to account for the physical evidence discovered in the hidden cellar. The most disturbing piece of evidence emerged in 1959 when renovations to the McDowell County Courthouse uncovered a sealed evidence box in a forgotten storage room. Inside was a glass jar labeled simply Reed Property, 1862. According to the courthouse maintenance supervisor's statement to the local newspaper, the jar contained what appeared to be a preserved human finger, wearing a gold band, the McDowell County Register reported on May 17, 1959, a grisly discovery during courthouse. Renovations has reignited interest in one of the county's oldest unsolved mysteries. Workers removing cabinets from the former sheriff's office uncovered evidence apparently related to the disappearance of the Reed sisters nearly a century ago. County officials have declined to specify the nature of the evidence, stating only that it has been transferred to state authorities for further examination. However, courthouse employee Thomas Jenkins provided a more detailed account to the newspaper's reporter. It was a finger, plain as day, floating in some kind of liquid. Looked like it had been cut clean off at the knuckle. Had a gold wedding band still on it. The label said it came from the Reed place back in '62. Gave me the shivers looking at it, knowing it's been sitting in the wall all these years. Jenkins added a detail not included in the published article. According to his daughter's later account, there was a small tag tied to the ring with thread. Dad said it had a name written on it, Holloway, and what looked like a date. He remembered it because he'd gone to school with a boy named Holloway years before. County officials quickly removed the jar, and no official statement was ever released. The courthouse clerk who initially reported the discovery recanted his statement days later, claiming he had been mistaken about what he saw. The evidence box and its contents were reportedly transferred to state authorities, but no record of its arrival exists in state archives. The case took another turn in 1965 when excavation for a new hunting lodge near the former Reed property unearthed a collection of human bones. According to the sheriff's report, dated July 7, 1965, construction workers digging the foundation for the lodge discovered the remains in what appeared to be a sinkhole, approximately 200 yards from where the hidden cellar had been discovered decades earlier. Sheriff Harold Monroe's report states, examination of the site revealed a natural limestone depression containing human skeletal remains. Dr. Westfall from the county medical examiner's office has confirmed the bones appear to be human, and estimates they belong to between 5 and 7 adult individuals, predominantly male based on pelvic structure, though precise determination is difficult due to their fragmented condition. The medical examiner's preliminary report attached to the sheriff's documentation noted several unusual features of the remains. Many of the larger bones show evidence of tool marks consistent with butchering techniques rather than animal scavenging or natural decomposition. Several skulls exhibit precise circular holes approximately 1 inch in diameter at the crown. Most concerning is evidence that these remains were subjected to boiling or similar heat treatment before disposal, based on discoloration patterns and surface texture of the bone. Construction worker Roy Collins, who discovered the remains, gave a statement to local newspaper reporter Frank Bennett that was never published. It wasn't just bones we found. There were personal effects too, buttons, boot eyelets, even a pocket watch that had turned green with age. And the bones weren't just tossed in there. They were arranged somehow like somebody had sorted them by type. All the skulls were together, then arm bones, leg bones, like that. Most had saw marks on the ends, like somebody had been taking pieces off them. Sheriff told us not to talk about it. Said it would hurt property values in the area and cause needless concern. Carbon dating performed at West Virginia University placed the remains in the mid-19th century, corresponding with the period when the Reed sisters occupied the property. The university's laboratory report, dated September 1965, estimated the deaths occurred between 1855 and 1865, with a margin of error of approximately 5 years. Despite this discovery, no definitive connection to the Reed sisters was established in official records. The investigation was quietly closed in 1966, with the remains interred in an unmarked grave in the Welch Municipal Cemetery. The medical examiner's full report was sealed by court order and later reported missing from county archives in 1968. The same year, the Reed ledger disappeared from the Historical Society. Professor Emeritus Howard Limpkin of Marshall University, who briefly examined the remains before their reburial, published a paper in the obscure Journal of Appalachian Historical Forensics in 1967 suggesting that the bones showed evidence of systematic processing for consumption. His academic career suffered after this publication, and he was denied tenure the following year. In a rare interview given to the Charleston Gazette in 1975, Limpkin maintained, "What we found in those mountains wasn't just murder, it was methodical harvesting. Those remains had been treated as livestock, not victims. Someone had been selecting, preparing, and consuming human beings with scientific precision." Limpkin elaborated on details excluded from his published paper. The skulls we examined had been opened in a very specific manner, with a circular piece removed from the crown using what appeared to be a specialized trephining tool. The brain would have been accessible through this opening. Other remains showed evidence of selective removal of organs. The chest cavities had been opened with surgical precision rather than the rough cuts one would expect from typical foul play. Whoever did this had anatomical knowledge and specific interest in certain body parts. What emerges from these fragmented accounts is a disturbing picture of two women who may have been conducting macabre experiments in human consumption, possibly driven by beliefs in obtaining vitality or longevity through their forbidden suppers. But what became of the Reed sisters themselves? Their fate remains one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. No record exists of their deaths or relocation. They simply vanished, leaving behind a perfectly arranged home that suggested they intended to return. Some theories propose that they fled when they realized authorities were growing suspicious of their activities. Others suggest a darker fate, that their final guest may have discovered their intentions and turned the tables on his would-be hosts. A tantalizing clue appeared in 1967 when historian Rebecca Thornton, researching Civil War-era asylum records, discovered admission documents for two unnamed women at the Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, dated November 1862. The women, described as sisters of mature age from the western counties, were admitted by a Dr. Blackwood for unnatural appetites and dangerous delusions regarding the consumption of human flesh. The admission record, preserved in the hospital's archived ledgers, provides a clinical description. Patients exhibit rational faculties in most respects, but maintain a shared delusion regarding the transfer of vitality through consumption of prepared human tissue. The elder sister is the more coherent of the two, explaining at length their father's theories on prolonging life through specific dietary practices. The younger displays physical symptoms including tremors, pallor, and occasional confusion, possibly resulting from their experimental regimen or exposure to chemicals used in their preparations. The admitting physician further noted patients were transported under sedation after being found in possession of human remains prepared for consumption. Their home reportedly contained evidence of numerous similar incidents. The referring physician, Dr. Blackwood of McDowell County, has requested their identities be protected due to their family's former social standing and to prevent public panic regarding their activities. They will be registered under the names Mary and Elizabeth Smith for institutional purposes. The hospital's superintendent's notes indicate that the women were kept in isolation from other patients, both for the safety of the general population and because their discussion of their dietary practices causes extreme distress among staff and other inmates. Regular entries track their condition over the following months, noting that both women refused conventional food and grew progressively weaker. A particularly disturbing entry dated January 15, 1863, reads, "Elder patient continued to request specific organ meats, particularly brain tissue, claiming it essential for her sister's recovery. When denied, she became agitated, explaining in scientific terminology how consuming neural matter transfers cognitive abilities from the deceased to the consumer. Her manner was not that of a lunatic, but of an educated researcher defending a controversial thesis. Most troubling was her rational offer to demonstrate their theories. If we would provide a recently deceased patient for their preparation methods. A subsequent note from February 1863 reports an incident involving an orderly attendant Wilson discovered elder sister attempting to remove tissue from her own forearm with a shard of glass. When restrained, she explained calmly that in the absence of preferred materials, she intended to prepare a portion of herself to nourish her declining sister, stating, "The transfer is less efficient from related tissue, but should provide temporary sustenance until proper specimens can be obtained." Sister's wound was dressed and stricter supervision implemented. A final entry, dated February 23, 1863, records, "The younger sister expired at 4:17 this morning after 3 days of delirium. Her sister, upon being informed, displayed no visible emotion, but requested permission to prepare the body according to their father's methods. Request denied. Elder sister now refusing all sustenance and medical attention." A subsequent entry from March 2, 1863, simply states, "Remaining sister found deceased in her cell this morning. Apparent self-starvation. Bodies interred in unmarked graves as per policy for unclaimed patients." The attending physician's personal notes, discovered in a collection donated to the University of Virginia Medical Archives in 1952, included this reflection, "I remain uncertain whether these women were insane in the traditional sense or whether they had simply crossed boundaries of acceptable scientific inquiry into realms normal minds refused to consider." The elder sisters' discourse on their theories was disturbingly coherent, with references to historical practices and detailed biochemical processes beyond the education of most women of the era. If their father indeed conducted similar research during his lifetime, one must wonder what experiences shaped their development and led them to pursue such macabre experimentation. While circumstantial, the timing, description, and connection to Dr. Blackwood have led many researchers to believe these women were indeed Margaret and Eleanor Reed, secretly committed by the doctor who may have discovered the true nature of their activities. This theory gained support in 1968, when local historian Arthur Simmons discovered a letter from Dr. Blackwood to the McDowell County Sheriff dated October 30, 1862, 2 days after Constable Whitaker's investigation of the Reed homestead. In the letter, Blackwood writes, "Having treated the Reed sisters professionally for some time, I have arranged for their transport to a facility better equipped to address their particular afflictions. Please consider the matter of their unexplained absence resolved, as they are now receiving appropriate care. I have taken the liberty of securing certain items from their home that might cause unnecessary speculation should they be discovered by others." The letter continued, "The nature of their condition is such that public knowledge would serve no purpose, except to cause distress among the community and potentially harm the reputation of their late father, who was respected in academic circles despite his unconventional research. I have consulted with Judge Harkins, who agrees that discretion is preferable to a public inquiry that would reveal nothing of benefit to the community during these already troubled times." A postscript, written in a less formal hand, added, "James, I strongly advise having the cellar entrance sealed permanently and certain documents burned rather than preserved. Some knowledge is too dangerous to maintain, even as historical record. The sisters' experiment with human consumption has progressed far beyond what anyone might suspect, and their notes contain methodology that should never be replicated. I will explain further when next we meet." The Blackwood letter disappeared from county archives later that same year, along with numerous other documents related to the Reed case. This systematic removal of evidence has fueled speculation about a deliberate attempt to erase this disturbing chapter from local history, though by whom and for what purpose remains unclear. Martha Collins, who worked as an archivist for the County Historical Society from 1965 to 1970, provided a sworn statement in 1972 claiming that a group of men identifying themselves as representatives of the State Historical Commission had visited in late 1968 and requested access to all materials related to the Reed sisters. They spent 3 days reviewing documents, making notes, and photocopying certain pages. When they left, they took the original Reed ledger and several related documents, claiming they were being transferred to climate-controlled state facilities for preservation. No receipt was provided, and subsequent inquiries to the State Commission were met with denials of any such project or personnel. Collins further stated, one of the men, who appeared to be supervising the others, mentioned that his grandfather had known the Reed sisters personally. He seemed particularly interested in their preparations and recipes, taking extensive notes from the ledger. When I inquired about his historical interest, he said something about family traditions of longevity that I found odd at the time. The property where the Reed homestead once stood remains unoccupied to this day. When the Allegheny Lumber Company attempted to build employee housing there in 1931, 3 workers suffered serious accidents during initial construction. Company records indicate the project was abandoned after a foreman reported that his men refused to continue working on what they had come to call the bad ground. According to an internal memo dated June 1931, discovered during research for a corporate history of Allegheny lumber in 1978, workers report unusual phenomena, including tools disappearing only to be found arranged in patterns some distance away, unexplained cold spots even on warm days, and a persistent odor described as like a slaughterhouse emanating from the soil near the old foundation. While management attributes these reports to superstitious imagination, the frequency of accidents, 3 broken limbs, 1 severe laceration, and 2 cases of unexplained illness in 3 weeks, suggests the site may have geological instability, making it unsuitable for construction. Local residents have historically avoided the area, claiming that the ground there feels wrong. A survey team in 1952 recommended against development, citing unstable soil conditions, though geological surveys show no obvious reason why the land would be unsuitable for building. James Moreland, who led the 1952 survey, later told colleagues at the State Geological Office there was nothing scientifically wrong with that land. No sinkholes, no unusual mineral compositions, no contamination we could detect. But every member of my team reported feeling physically ill when working near the old homestead site. Equipment malfunctioned, compass readings varied wildly, and photographic film came out fogged or showing strange shadows not visible to the naked eye. I'm a man of science, not superstition, but I wouldn't build on that land for any amount of money. Perhaps most chilling is the account from Thomas Harmon, a forest ranger who patrolled the area in the 1950s. In a recorded oral history preserved in the state archives, he described finding arranged stones in a circular pattern near where the Reed house once stood. Every spring, he recalled, someone had set 2 place settings, just rocks arranged like plates and cups. No one ever saw who did it, but it happened every year around the same time, usually mid-April. After I reported it, they transferred me to another district. I heard they bulldozed that whole section a few years later. Harmon elaborated. The stone settings were always arranged the same way, 2 place settings facing each other, with a third set slightly apart, as if for a guest. Once I found what looked like dried blood on one of the stones, though it could have been rust or lichen. I set up a hunting blind one year to see who was doing it, but after 2 nights of waiting, I woke up to find the stones had been arranged while I slept, not 30 yards from where I was. Never heard a sound. That's when I requested transfer to another district. The road expansion Harmon referred to was completed in 1956, effectively erasing any remaining physical traces of the Reed sisters' presence. The case files, physical evidence, and many of the primary documents related to the Reed sisters mysteriously disappeared from various archives between 1965 and 1968, leading some to speculate about a deliberate attempt to erase this disturbing chapter from local history. In 1969, journalist Michael Crawford began researching the Reed case for a planned book. His investigation ended abruptly after he received anonymous threats warning him to let sleeping history lie. Crawford abandoned the project, and his collected research materials were reportedly destroyed in a house fire in 1970, though he and his family escaped unharmed. Crawford gave only one interview about his abandoned book to a small local paper in 1972. He said, "Some stories don't want to be told." What happened in those mountains during the war wasn't just about two strange women and their dinner guests. There were powerful people involved, people whose descendants still hold influence in the region. The Reed sisters were conducting experiments, yes, but I don't believe they were working alone or that their work ended with their disappearance. Crawford continued, "During my research, I uncovered correspondence suggesting Thomas Reed had been part of a network of researchers investigating human consumption for vitality. This network included physicians, academics, and wealthy individuals in positions of power, primarily along the eastern seaboard. The Reed sisters may have been continuing not just their father's work, but the work of a larger organization that preferred to remain hidden. I believe some members of this group intervened to suppress evidence when the construction discoveries threatened to expose their historical connection to these practices." The journalist concluded with a disturbing observation. "I also found population statistics suggesting unusually high rates of disappearances in regions where members of this network resided, not just during the Civil War when such absences might be expected, but continuing into the early 20th century. Most troubling were county health records showing several individuals connected to these researchers living well beyond normal life expectancy for the era, often maintaining physical vigor into extreme old age. I was preparing to investigate these longevity cases when the threats began." Crawford died of apparent heart failure 3 months after this interview. At the age of 42, the medical examiner found no evidence of foul play, though Crawford had no history of cardiac problems and had passed a physical examination the previous year. What we're left with are fragments, newspaper clippings, oral histories, and the troubling questions about what actually occurred on that remote mountainside during the chaos of the Civil War. Were the Reed sisters simply eccentric, recluses whose unusual behaviors were transformed into something sinister by superstitious locals? Or did they indeed host forbidden suppers where unsuspecting travelers became the main course? The most disturbing possibility, suggested by the contents of their ledger, is that they believed they were deriving some benefit from these macabre meals, a sensation of vitality that lasted until dawn. Such beliefs have historical precedents in various cultures, where consuming parts of the dead was thought to transfer strength or other qualities from the deceased. The Reed sisters' father, Thomas, had reportedly studied medicine briefly in Richmond before withdrawing under uncertain circumstances. According to records from the Medical College of Virginia, accessed by historians in 1965 before they too disappeared from archives, Thomas Reed was dismissed from the institution in 1823 after presenting a paper on nutritive consumption for vitality enhancement, that faculty deemed repugnant to natural law and Christian morality. His lecture notes, partially preserved in the college archives, proposed that specific preparations of fresh human tissue, when consumed according to precise methods, produce measurable improvements in physical vigor, mental acuity, and resistance to aging. The notes further suggested that certain organs, particularly the brain and heart, contain the greatest concentration of vital essence, which may be transferred through proper preparation and consumption. A colleague's written objection to Reed's research, dated October 1823, provides additional context. Reed claims his theories derive from ancient medical texts discovered during his European travels, particularly certain banned manuscripts in private collections in Austria and Hungary. More concerning is his admission of having verified his hypotheses through practical experimentation, though he refuses to detail his methodology or subjects. His calm certainty regarding the efficacy of consuming human flesh, presented as if discussing a conventional medical treatment, suggests a dangerous moral detachment that has no place in our profession. Reed apparently continued his research privately after his dismissal, and it seems his daughters inherited not only his property, but also his unorthodox theories. In the isolated mountains of Civil War-era Appalachia, two educated women experimenting with such ideas would have operated with virtual impunity. Travelers disappeared frequently during this chaotic period, and with limited communication between communities. The Reed sisters could have continued their activities for years without arousing serious suspicion. By 1968, most physical evidence related to the case had vanished. The chamber where they stored their specimens was destroyed. The ledger detailing their activities disappeared. The medical examiner's report on the human remains found near their property vanished. Even the preserved human finger discovered in the courthouse was removed from the historical record. The systematic removal of evidence suggests a coordinated effort to erase the case from public memory. Some researchers have proposed that wealthy or influential individuals may have participated in the Reed sisters' experiments, whether knowingly or as victims, creating a motivation for descendants to suppress the story. Others suggest that similar practices may have continued in the region, with modern practitioners protecting their historical predecessors. Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, an anthropologist specializing in folklore and ritual practices, published a paper in 1978 titled Consumptive Rituals and Longevity Myths in Appalachian Communities, which examined the Reed case as part of a broader cultural phenomenon. What distinguishes the Reed situation from typical cannibal witch folklore, she wrote, is the scientific framework they apparently applied to traditional magical thinking. They weren't consuming human flesh out of depravity or desperation, but as part of a controlled experiment with specific expected outcomes. This represents a unique intersection of Enlightenment scientific methodology with ancient magical practices regarding the consumption of human remains. Harmon's research uncovered similar cases elsewhere in the Appalachian region during the 19th century, though none with as much documentary evidence as the Reed sisters. In several isolated communities, she noted, I found persistent legends of individuals or families who consumed human remains for supposed health benefits, typically targeting specific organs believed to confer particular qualities: brain for intelligence, heart for courage, liver for vitality, and so forth. These practices were always shrouded in secrecy and typically attributed to European immigrants who brought Old World knowledge with them to the mountains. Her most disturbing finding came from interviews with elderly residents of McDowell County who shared stories passed down through generations. Several informants independently described a tradition of what they called special eating among certain families of high social standing, Harmon wrote. According to these accounts, these families occasionally gathered for private dinners where they consumed preparations containing human remains, believing this practice explained their unusual health and longevity. While impossible to verify, the consistency of these stories across unrelated sources suggests they may have some historical basis. What remains are questions that will likely never be answered. How many travelers met their end at the Reed sisters' table? What drove two apparently respectable women to such extremes? And perhaps most disturbing, did they achieve what they sought through their forbidden consumption? A final enigmatic note appears in the margin of the church registry from 1894, more than 30 years after the sisters disappeared. The pastor at that time recorded a visit from two elderly women, sisters they claimed, passing through from the eastern cities, who inquired about the old Reed property and seemed disappointed to learn it remained unoccupied. The pastor noted that the women declined to give their names and left town the same day, traveling east in a black carriage. He further observed that despite their advanced age, estimated at 70 years or more, both ladies displayed remarkable vigor and clarity of mind, with complexions and movement suggesting women decades younger. The pastor's final comment reads, "Something in their intense gaze reminded me of tales I have heard of the Reed sisters who vanished during the war years. A disturbing encounter that left me troubled in spirit." The pastor, Reverend Josiah Williams, later confided to his wife a detail omitted from the official church record. According to a letter she wrote to her sister in 1895, discovered in a family collection in 1981, Josiah says the older of the two women who visited last autumn bore a striking resemblance to a portrait of Margaret Reed that once hung in the old courthouse. More troubling still, she asked specific questions about families in the area whose ancestors might have disappeared during the war years, taking particular interest in descendants who might possess superior vitality or intellect. When Josiah mentioned the old stories about the Reed sisters' disappearance, the woman smiled in a way that made his blood run cold and said, "Some appetites sustain rather than consume, Reverend, if properly directed." No further record of such visitors exists, and given the time elapsed, it seems unlikely these could have been the Reed sisters themselves, who would have been well into their 70s by then. Perhaps they were relatives, or simply travelers who had heard the local legends. A curious postscript to the case emerged in 1948, when an elderly man named James Holloway contacted the McDowell County Historical Society, claiming to be the great-nephew of the James Holloway, mentioned in connection with the Reed sisters in 1862. According to the Society's visitor log, Holloway requested information about the women who hosted my great-uncle at their table shortly before his disappearance. The Historical Society reported having no information, but Holloway left behind a family letter dated 1867, in which his grandfather described searching for his missing brother. The letter, which remained in the Historical Society's collection until its disappearance in 1968, reportedly included this passage: "I traced James as far as a remote homestead belonging to two spinster women named Reed. The local constable informed me they too had vanished some months after James was last seen. Before departing the region, I encountered a physician who had treated these women. Though he would say little, he warned me that my brother had likely been consumed in more ways than one at their table. I pray this is merely mountain superstition, rather than the horrible truth it suggests." The letter continued with a disturbing detail. "Most troubling was the physician's warning that I should abandon my search, as it might attract unwelcome attention from associates of the Reed family in Richmond and Philadelphia. He hinted that their activities were part of a larger endeavor, involving persons of influence who would prefer to remain undiscovered. When I pressed him for clarity, he said only, 'Some believe they have found the key to extended life, sir, though the price they pay and exact from others is beyond Christian reckoning. What's certain is that the story of the Reed sisters and their forbidden suppers has persisted in the oral tradition of McDowell County for generations, a whispered warning about the darkness that can fester in isolation when human bonds fray and appetites turn toward the unthinkable. The land where their home once stood remains empty, the forest slowly reclaiming what was briefly human domain. Hikers on the nearby Appalachian Trail occasionally report an unusual silence in that section of woods, not the absence of sound, but a quality to the air that dampens even the wind in the trees. Several hikers who unknowingly camped near the former Reed property have reported vivid dreams of being watched by two women standing motionless among the trees, their eyes reflecting moonlight like animals in the dark. Park Ranger David Coleman, who documented these accounts between 1985 and 1992, noted consistent elements across dozens of independent reports. The descriptions are remarkably similar. Two women in dark dresses with high collars standing absolutely still at the forest's edge. The taller one is described as severe-looking with her hair pulled back tightly, while the shorter has a more pleasant face but never speaks. Multiple hikers report waking to find small arrangements of stones placed beside their tents in the configuration of dinner settings. Coleman, who initially dismissed these stories as campfire tales, became less skeptical after his own experience in the area. "I was photographing flora for the Park Service database near the old Reed property when I distinctly heard a woman's voice call my name. When I turned, I saw what appeared to be two figures in dark clothing standing approximately 50 yards away among the trees. When I approached, they were gone. but I found two smooth stones placed precisely where they had been standing. I have no explanation for this incident, though I remain reluctant to attribute it to supernatural causes, and according to rangers who patrol the area, every few years someone reports finding two places set with stones in a clearing near where the Reed house once stood. By the time authorities investigate, the arrangements are always gone, with no evidence of who might have created them or why. In 1959, following the discovery of the preserved finger in the courthouse, local newspaper editor Frank Bennett published an editorial calling for a comprehensive investigation into the Reed case. Some stories refuse to remain buried, he wrote, echoing across the decades like a dinner bell calling from a forgotten homestead on a remote mountain slope, inviting us to a supper where we might be guest, or we might be meal. Bennett was found dead in his home 3 weeks later, apparently from a heart attack. The medical examiner noted nothing suspicious, though several colleagues reported that Bennett had been in excellent health and had mentioned receiving anonymous phone calls in the days before his death. His successor as editor, Thomas Grant, discovered among Bennett's personal effects a journal containing notes on the Reed case that were never published. According to Grant's private correspondence, preserved by his daughter and made available to researchers in 1990, Bennett had been preparing a series of articles based on information provided by an elderly source claiming to be descended from one of Dr. Blackwood's colleagues. Bennett's notes included this disturbing passage. Source claims Reed sisters were part of a society dating to European aristocratic circles, dedicated to extending life through consumption of specific human tissues. Members identified promising subjects, prepared them according to recipes developed over centuries, and consumed them in ritual meals. The practice allegedly continues among certain wealthy families who maintain the tradition in secret, explaining unusual longevity among certain bloodlines. Source claims to have witnessed such a gathering in Richmond in 1932, where participants appeared decades younger than their known ages. Grant never pursued the story, noting in his letter, "After what happened to Frank, I decided some stones are better left unturned." The morning after his funeral, I found 2 dinner plates arranged on my front porch, empty but for a small handwritten note that read simply, "Some appetites are never satisfied." I burned Bennett's notes that same day and have never spoken of this matter until now. In the end, the most terrifying aspect of the Reed sisters' case may be how completely they vanished from history, leaving behind only fragments that hint at their unspeakable appetites. In the hidden hollows of the Appalachians, some secrets remain buried, some hungers never fully satisfied. Those who have studied the case most thoroughly often reach the same disturbing conclusion. The Reed sisters were not merely killers, but scientists of a sort, methodically testing their father's theories about transferring vitality through consumption. Their meticulous records, specialized equipment, and apparent selection of victims suggest a chilling rationality behind their actions. More unsettling still is the possibility that they achieved results. The church registry's mention of elderly women with remarkable vigor visiting decades later raises the specter that their methods, however horrific, produced the longevity they sought. If so, did their knowledge die with them? Or did others continue their work in secret, maintaining their youth through forbidden consumption? Residents of McDowell County still speak of certain remote homesteads where travelers are welcomed with unusual hospitality, especially during harsh winter months when food is traditionally scarce. They warn children not to accept dinner invitations from strangers, particularly women who live alone and set their tables too fine for common folk. A local saying, documented by folklore researchers in the 1970s, advises, when dining with strangers, always ask what's on the menu before becoming what's on the table. Parents traditionally warn children never to tell anyone if they're traveling alone, and to always let someone know their intended route when journeying through the mountains. And occasionally, in the oldest part of the Welch Municipal Cemetery, visitors report seeing fresh flowers placed on the unmarked grave, where the bones from the sinkhole were interred, flowers arranged in a circle like place settings at an eternal table. Cemetery caretaker Willard Simmons reported in 1982 that these floral arrangements appeared every April 17th, rain or shine, though he never observed who placed them. In 1998, anthropology student Rebecca Thornton, no relation to the earlier historian of the same surname, conducted her doctoral research on the persistence of the Reed sisters legend in local culture. Her dissertation, Consumption as Metaphor. The Reed sisters, in Appalachian oral tradition, documented how the story had evolved from historical events into a regional cautionary tale. What makes the Reed case fascinating from a folkloric perspective, she wrote, is how it reflects larger anxieties about consumption, both literal and metaphorical. In the most basic sense, it's a warning about cannibalism, the ultimate taboo. But it also functions as a metaphor for how wealthy, educated outsiders consumed vulnerable local populations, using isolation and deprivation to their advantage. The Reed sisters represent a fear of being devoured by forces beyond one's control or understanding. Thornton noted that while conducting interviews in McDowell County, she encountered unexpected resistance. Several potential informants refused to discuss the Reed sisters at all, claiming it was dangerous to wake sleeping stories. Others would speak only in euphemisms, referring to those women who set fine tables or the sisters who had unusual tastes. Most troubling were veiled warnings from local officials suggesting I redirect my research to less sensitive historical matters. This active suppression of the narrative suggests it retains power beyond typical folklore. Her most significant finding came from census and actuarial records for the region. I identified several families historically connected to the Reed sisters, either as business associates, neighbors, or mentioned in surviving documentation, and tracked their descendants through public records. Curiously, these lineages show statistically significant patterns of longevity, with family members routinely living into their late 90s, or even past 100, often maintaining physical and mental vigor well beyond normal aging patterns. While this could be attributed to genetics or lifestyle factors, the correlation with proximity to the Reed case is difficult to dismiss entirely. Thornton's academic advisor suggested removing this section from her dissertation, warning that such speculation could damage her professional credibility. The final published version contained no mention of these longevity patterns, though Thornton preserved her original research in private papers. Perhaps it's better that way. Some appetites, once awakened, are never truly satisfied. Some recipes are best left forgotten, and some suppers should remain forever forbidden. As this account draws to a close, one final document deserves mention, a letter discovered in 2001 during renovation of an old law office in Charleston, West Virginia. Dated 1967 and never sent, it was written by retired Judge William Harkins, Jr., grandson of the judge who sold Thomas Reed his property in 1831. The letter, addressed to the State Historical Society but apparently never mailed, reads in part, "As I approach the end of my life, I feel compelled to reveal certain family knowledge regarding the Reed sisters of McDowell County. My grandfather, who facilitated their father's purchase of the isolated property where they conducted their activities, was aware of Thomas Reed's research interests and may have shared them to some degree. Among my grandfather's papers, I discovered correspondence suggesting he had dined with the Reed family on multiple occasions and experienced what he described as remarkable rejuvenation. Afterward, the letter continues, more disturbing is my discovery that certain prominent families in our state, including my own, may have benefited from the Reed sisters' preparations over many years. Family correspondence hints at private gatherings where specially prepared vitality supplements were consumed, always in strict secrecy. The remarkable longevity enjoyed by members of these families, including my own unusual vigor at 94 years of age, suggests these practices may have had the effects claimed by their proponents. Harkins concluded, I have witnessed 3 generations of certain families engaging in these practices, always protected by wealth, social position, and professional connections that ensure discretion. I believe similar circles exist in other regions, particularly in older East Coast cities with European connections. As my time grows short, I find myself troubled by complicity in a tradition that, however beneficial to its participants, comes at an unthinkable cost to others. Yet, even as I write these words, I recognize my own moral cowardice in waiting until my approaching death to reveal what I have known for decades. The letter was never sent, and Judge Harkins died peacefully in his sleep 1 week after writing it, at the age of 94. His descendants denied knowledge of any connection to the Reed case and suggested the letter was the product of an elderly mind, affected by dementia, despite Harkins having presided over complex cases until his retirement at age 92. The land where the Reed homestead once stood remains undeveloped, now part of a protected wilderness area where no construction is permitted. Rangers who patrol the area report that wildlife avoids a certain clearing where the house once stood, and vegetation grows poorly there despite favorable soil conditions. And somewhere, perhaps, the Reed sisters still set their table for dinner, waiting for guests who will become more than just companions for a meal. Their appetites, according to their own records, were never fully satisfied, only temporarily appeased, until the next traveler came down the lonely mountain road, seeking shelter for the night. In the words of Margaret Reed's final diary entry, "What we consume becomes part of us. What we become depends entirely on what or whom we choose to consume." Father understood that vitality transfers most effectively from the living to the living. Our guests provide us with more than mere sustenance. They provide us with their essence, their potential, their future years. A fair exchange, we believe, for a final supper served with our very best china.